When you think of the Clone Wars, you probably think about clone troopers, which is fair enough given the name. You may also think about battle droids, but while clones and droids tended to make up the most important part of the forces we see in Star Wars media, what we see a lot less often are the many battles in the Clone Wars where nobody would have laid an eye on a single clone trooper. And I want to talk a little bit about that side of the Clone Wars, giving hopefully a better idea of what the broader conflict looked like, and specifically how it really expressed itself as a series of proxy wars. It involved the eruption and sometimes resolution of thousands of local conflicts, where armies of clone troopers and battle droids could turn the tide, but weren't always the main focus, and sometimes weren't the focus at all. Despite pushes by individuals like Ranulph Tarkin to encourage the creation of a standing army for the Republic, it wasn't until the Military Creation Act and the revelation of the Clone Grand Army that this was actually established. But comparisons of the massive CIS forces at the opening of the war to the relatively meager clone army tend to leave out any consideration of the planetary militias and defense forces which existed throughout the Republic and Separatist territory. These do show up fairly often directly in media, especially in the Clone Wars animated series where you have things like the Gungans getting involved all the time. But we do see examples on the other side, like the Umbaran militia going back and forth and the Quarren fighting against the Mon Calamari. These could be seen as side conflicts to the larger war, but the prevalence of these kinds of militias and the role they play in the war gets especially highlighted in most supplemental material like the Essential Guide to Warfare, which says, quote, "Contrary to what one might have gathered from the HoloNet, the Republic's armies contained both clone troopers and non-clone units. Some epic battles of the Clone Wars were fought without a single clone in the Republic ranks. While clone and non-clone units sometimes serve side by side, coordinating the two proved difficult. With the exception of officers, most non-clone troops served in the Planetary Security Forces, which were largely used in defensive deployments or with the Judicials. The Judicials were essentially a kind of military police force, while Planetary Security Forces tended to be the actual military forces of the planet in question. This is something that every planet would have had to some degree, but we can also add local militias on top of that. When the war kicked off, any group that was dissatisfied with the Republic, even on a Republic-aligned planet, would have organized either on their own or through the spurring of CIS agents into making their own active force fighting against the local Republic-aligned forces. And as we'll talk about more as the video goes on, this could go in either direction. Over the course of the war, planetary militias and security forces did end up getting more directly integrated into the forces of either side, but I want to kind of reframe how we think about the Clone Wars to help show how the role of these planetary forces tended to play out. Rather than thinking of the Republic and the CIS as these unified blocks with one military and set territory, think of most planets as contested grounds, with different groups supporting either the Republic or the CIS, and in some cases, perhaps a bit more accurately, think of them more as looking to see which side could give them an upper hand against local enemies, rather than being about a principled loyalty to either bloc. For example, especially with the Wookiees and clone forces being fairly integrated in Episode 3, it's tempting to think of Kashyyyk and the Wookiee warriors as a firm, stalwart ally of the Republic throughout the war, but the reality was a lot more complicated. In the early days, Kashyyyk and its colonies, like many different planets, hoped to remain neutral in the conflict, although they didn't fully withdraw from the Republic or the Senate. Their biggest military concern wasn't the CIS or the Republic, it was instead their relationship with Trandosha, another planet within the same system. Wookiee King and respected council member Greg Chawa negotiated with both the Republic and the CIS, hoping to find a partner which could secure them against the Trandoshans who had a tendency to hunt the Wookiees. In exchange, Grakchawa was willing to barter the Wookiees' knowledge of local hyperspace routes. Diplomatic genius that he was, the CIS Supreme Commander General Grievous messed this opportunity up. He tried to force the Wookiees into making a choice faster by launching attacks against them. This became especially problematic when Grakchawa's son Rakume was killed by battle droids in one such attack, pushing the Wookiees into the Republic's camp where they liked this video and subscribed for more. So I guess technically it did speed up their decision, just not the way Grievous might have hoped. But in this example, you can kind of see how this almost transactional relationship existed between the Republic, the CIS, and these individual contested worlds. This is a situation where some of the alignments changed by planet on a more local level, where the Trandoshans ended up more in the CIS camp fighting against the Wookiees, who ended up in the Republic camp. This kind of scene repeated throughout the Clone Wars. Local tensions would lead to jockeying for attention from the two main belligerents, with both sides often just looking for support in their own power struggles. In the case of Kashyyyk, the Republic ultimately did decide to send support against the droid attack on the Wookiees. But these kinds of moves were as much an attempt by the Republic and CIS to garner that local support as it was to protect clear allies in existing territories. And there was a period of time where the Republic's support of the Wookiees wasn't necessarily a given. It's important to remember that there were large sections of the galaxy not officially under Republic control before the war, or where the Republic was present in name only. So the Clone Wars saw a massive expansion of Republic presence beyond their traditional sphere of influence, sometimes spurred on by the CIS's own occupations and bases. A flare-up in anti-Republic sentiment or a militia group popping up on the fringes of Republic planets would mean a response from Republic forces or Republic-supported forces, allowing them to establish more control in an area they may not have touched directly otherwise. So generally you ended up in a situation where these militias and planetary security forces would be fighting amongst themselves in a kind of proxy war. Or one side would have proxy forces at best supplied or trained by themselves, while the other side was there directly. Onderon is one such example, where the Republic didn't believe they could spare the forces to hold the world, but they saw the value in Saw Gerrera's military group fighting against the CIS, at least after some convincing. So Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka were dispatched to train the Onderon militias, which later had help from the Onderon Royal Guard fighting against the CIS occupation. This dynamic went both ways. Anti-Republic sentiment was not a new thing, and a big part of the CIS's strategy was to incite other pre-existing groups to either join their confederacy, or just to keep the Republic as busy as possible. One CIS leader in particular was famous for this, General Horn Ambigine. He had spent years leading an active anti-Republic militia before the Clone Wars in the Tydane system, causing Count Dooku to recruit him and then move him to Pizandius, granting him the title of Commander of Organic Training within the CIS, essentially making him run daily TED Talks on how to grow your own militia force to fight the Republic at home. When the rebellion started, Horn renounced the Confederacy and threw his support behind the rebellion as leader of the BRIC sector force. No matter which side your militia was theoretically fighting for or against, you would hope that the main forces of either belligerent would come and support you. But the irony is, the more support you had from either side, the more it meant Imperial forces later would either be there already or want to go there to fight off the separatist holdouts. Larger military movement during the war to a system ultimately gave the Empire standing to fully integrate territory which previously was much more loosely within, or even entirely outside, the Republic's sphere of influence. Geonosis, for example, was not a Republic member world before the Clone Wars, but the Republic established a presence on the planet after the Battle of Geonosis. It did go back and forth during the war, and the planet's political and military makeup was a bit more complicated than it might seem. Archduke Poggle the Lesser was in charge, but his power had been gained only recently in a lower caste revolt within his hive, usurping Hattus the Vaulted and bolstering his reign with the support of the Sith. The war allowed a republic and an imperial presence on the world which otherwise might not have happened at all. This presence did not go well for the Geonosians in either the Legends or canon continuity, and many of the Geonosians on the world actually had no sympathy for the CIS in the first place. Very few planets are this monoculture with full allegiance for one side in a conflict. Even with the Geonosian hive mind, there are multiple Geonosian hives. In a lot of ways, these proxy conflicts, or conflicts between either belligerents and third-party groups in the Clone Wars, became the final expression of old colonialist programs and violence on individual worlds, or started whole new adventures in colonialism, leading up to a centralization of power under the Empire, which essentially brought all the local imperialisms into one bigger imperial umbrella. One such local colonial example shows us another theoretical separatist stronghold like Geonosis, which wasn't quite as united under the CIS banner as it may seem, Felucia. Felucia was an important part of the CIS war machine, acting as it did as the headquarters of the Commerce Guild, one of the mega corporations backing the Separatists. The Gossam colonies established by the Commerce Guild represented the majority of its political power, and the Alliance directed the planet's economy. But most of the planet's inhabitants are traditional Felucian farmers, a species likely descended from earlier Gossam explorers, and the separate jungle Felucian species. Over the course of the war, many of the Felucians in each group took up arms against the Separatists on the world, not because of any specific allegiance to the Republic, but because of the impact the megacorporations had on their worlds and lives. And this is only one example of a dynamic which played out across CIS territory, given the powers the megacorporations had been granted over the last millennium to colonize and exploit planets in certain regions of the galaxy. But again, this is not the same thing as those farmers being Republic aligned. For a lot of them, these were powers granted to these corporations by the Republic. So even if the Republic army may have represented a potential ally to fight against the more immediate CIS threat, it would be a bit too far to call them direct expressions of republicanism in the galaxy, or to call them truly Republic-aligned forces. There was a spectrum of that kind of allegiance. On the lower end, you had the planetary security forces that were working in their proxy wars, but then you did have some forces like the Gungans who occasionally were willing to go and fight on other fronts for the Republic. That's going to do it for today, though. I want to talk about the colonialism angle of the Clone Wars a bit more in a future video, and the way the Empire brought a lot of this together, but hopefully this gives you a slightly different perspective than you usually get to see of the Clone Wars, and takes it a little bit beyond just the droid versus clone conflict. Admittedly, this was a bit of a harder video to write because I'm trying to bring together a few different ideas here, but either way, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.